Hello everyone, Mr. B here, and it is time to learn about the wonderful brain. And we're going to start with the oldest part of the brain. And the way that the brain develops is kind of from the inside out. And so we start with something that's known as the hindbrain, as you will see in green. And with the hindbrain, the three parts that we're going to be focusing on is the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla is kind of in charge of basic functions for life. So things like your heartbeat and things like your respiration, which is vital for our survival. Therefore, it makes sense that it's kind of the first part of the brain to develop. Then we have the pons, and the pons is in charge of kind of wakefulness and sleeping. And so this is what essentially tells your body to wake up and then also tells it to go to sleep. Without this, we would just go to sleep and never wake up. So, pretty important. Then we have the cerebellum, which is this big part back here, and this is in charge of kind of coordination and balance. And so it's what helps to keep us on our feet and keep us from falling over. Again, very important for our survival when we're trying to run away from something, when we're trying to climb something, etc., etc. So that is the hindbrain. Then we get into the midbrain, and for that, you kind of just need to know one part. The reticular formation, seen here in pink. And the reticular formation is kind of the part of your brain that gets your attention. And what I mean by that is, with an example, let's say that you're at a party and, there's a lot of different conversations going on, a lot of people talking, you're talking to someone, and then someone says your name, like across the party, and immediately you're aware. You're like, who just said my name? That's your reticular formation. It's kind of always listening, always watching, always seeing if there's any immediate dangers around us. And if it thinks that there could be something, it gets your attention. And you're like, wait, why did it just get silent? If you're ever in a room that had like a fan going and then the fan turns off, you might not have realized that the fan was going, but the moment it turns off, you're like, what just happened? And then you're like, oh, the fan turned off. That's your reticular formation. Now we get into the big part, the forebrain. And I'm splitting this up into two different parts. So we're going to start kind of on the inside. And there's many different parts and huge different combinations. But again, we're just going to talk about some of it. And the first part is basal ganglia, which is kind of back here. I'm not going to be pointing out in particular a lot of these things. And the basal ganglia is more for, again, movement and coordination. So kind of similar to the cerebellum, but it's also with like moving around. Then we have the limbic system. The limbic system is comprised of a lot of different things. So part of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. And essentially what the limbic system does is it's in charge of your emotions, memory. The hippocampus is very big for memory. The amygdala is very big for emotions and what's known as your fear response. And it's kind of like learning as well. So learning, memory, and emotions are kind of the big processes for the limbic system. Another thing to know about is the thalamus. So again, some of the thalamus is in the limbic system. Some of the thalamus, as you can see up here, serves for, again, the sleep and wake cycle, but it's a little different. Again, as you will learn, different parts of the brain kind of do very similar things, but in different ways. But it's more taking in sensory input that then helps for that. So is it getting dark out? Is it getting light out? That sort of thing is the thalamus. Then we have, and it's kind of hard to see, but this thing right here, right? Is that the one? Or is it this one? Let me check. I lied. It's this big one right here. This is the corpus callosum. Kind of looks like a C. What it actually is, because this is just a cross-section, it is the part of the brain that communicates the two hemispheres, because we have kind of a big old chunk of brain here, big old chunk of brain there, and then there's just this strip that communicates the two sides, and that's the corpus callosum. All it does is communicate the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, left to right, etc., etc. So it helps it so both can communicate. Tomorrow you will watch a video that shows what happens when this is cut and the two hemispheres can no longer communicate with one another. The last part, in a sense, that we're going to learn about of the forebrain is then the cerebral cortex. And this does not give it justice, because essentially, let me line that up a little better, there we go. The cerebral cortex is it's what you tend to see on the brain. You see a little bit of the cerebellum poking out, but it's what you see covering the entire brain. This is the last part to develop, and it's kind of your executive functioning. It's what helps you problem solve. It's what helps you make good decisions. It's why as we're younger, sometimes we don't make the best decisions. It's because this part is still developing. But this isn't good enough. We're breaking down the cerebral cortex, because as you can see, it's quite big. We're breaking it down into 4 different lobes. And just like last time, I'm going to start with the back. And so what we have, and let me see, that's the wrong one. Where are you? There it is. There we go. In the very back, we have something known as the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is in charge of vision, which might not seem to make much sense because it's in the very back of the brain, but that's where it is. And so when information comes in through the eyes, which we're going to learn about more in the next chapter, it sends that information in the back. It's also why sometimes if you're hit in the back of the head, you'll see stars. It's because it's sending weird signals to the occipital lobe, and then it interprets it as like stars and flashes of lights. Then we are going to go to, I think it's this one. No. It's this one. There we go. No. It's this one. Yes. Okay. The parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is kind of somewhat on the top, and it is your kind of sense of pain, your sense of touch, your sense of hot and cold. It's everything in what we consider your sense of touch, which again we're going to talk about in way more detail in the next chapter. So that's the parietal lobe. Then we have, right there kind of in the middle, the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is kind of on either side. And so if you think about which sense is kind of on either side, it's your sense of hearing. And so that's the temporal lobe on either side. It runs kind of across like where your temple would be, and in charge of hearing and your perception of hearing. And then finally, we have in the front the frontal lobe, because it's in the front. And this is more, again, for things like, it's your higher mental planning. Again, the problem solving, making good decisions. It is what stops your amygdala, that emotional part of your brain, from just acting on impulse. It says, okay, yes, we know we're angry, but if we if we punch someone right now, we're going to get in trouble, so let's calm down. That's kind of what your frontal lobe does. And so, for the sake of this class, these are kind of the different parts and then the different lobes that you will need to know. And if you want to essentially see this entire thing again, but in music form, I made a music video about this last semester that uses this little cutout thing that I made as well. But hopefully that made sense. We will come back tomorrow again to see what happens when things go wrong and this corpus callosum is cut and the left hemisphere can't communicate with the right hemisphere.